Well, good afternoon or good morning, everyone. I'm Ian Lesser from GMF here in Brussels, and welcome to this second, actually, in a series of streamed conversations that we are doing from GMF that are endeavoring to look at both the European and the American status and perspectives on the COVID-19 crisis. And we're really delighted today to have with us two wonderful speakers. First, Rear Admiral retired John Kirby, who is a senior military and diplomatic analyst with CNN, also a former spokesperson of the State Department and the Pentagon, and also, I'm very pleased to say, a GMF board member. John, thank you very much for being with us today. And also Laura Rosenberger, a senior fellow at GMF and director of the Alliance for Securing Democracy. Two wonderful people to give us two, I think, complementary perspectives on what is happening in the United States, looking especially, I think, at the sort of diplomatic and military side of the equation, also how the media is responding to all of this. And then with Laura, we can pick up some of the issues concerning the politics of this, including the disinformation angle and other things in an election year that I think we'll all be interested in. So again, thank you for joining us. I understand we have about 200 people watching. Just a few housekeeping comments before we start. We're 45 minutes total. We'll end promptly at 3:45. There is an ability to ask questions, and if you use on Zoom your Q&A box, you can put in a question. Please do, if you can, tell us who you are and where you're from as well, and we'll keep track of those. I'm told that you really shouldn't use the chat box. It's better to use the Q&A. So if you would, please do that. I would be grateful. So without further ado, let me turn it over to John to start and share some thoughts with us on how the US is coping with this, especially in the diplomatic and the military realm. John, over to you. Thanks again.
Thank you very much, Ian. It's great to be with you, and I'm really delighted to be able to do this, even if it is just from my living room today. I want to talk just a little briefly about the military and the State Department, and then just touch on the media environment, since I do work at a cable network, in terms of how we're dealing with the virus as a story. But one of the themes that I think has been pulled through for me watching the military and the State Department deal with this is one of balance, and how each institution is struggling in their own way right now to try to find the proper balance. And when we think about balance, we tend to think of it as in a static way. You're either in or out of balance, sort of binary. And what I think you have to think about in terms of this virus is that it's very much a moving target. Every day, the balance you're trying to strike is going to be completely different because the virus is taking an exponential turn all throughout the world. So when you look at the military particularly, think about the things that they're responsible for on any given day. It's defending our security interests and protecting their troops. But they now have a third vector that they have to balance with respect to this virus, and that is the forced provision of assets and resources and people to states, to governors, to local municipalities all over the country. We've got the hospital ships, one in Los Angeles and one now in New York, that are starting to see patients. We've got National Guard and Reserve troops that the governors are calling out, MASH units, mobile army surgical hospitals that are being stood up in some of the hotspots around the country. And not to mention just the logistics, the transportation assets of the military that's being used, even so far as using military flights to repatriate Americans back home. So the military is very much involved domestically. In fact, I think yesterday I saw a report that another 500 US troops were going to the Mexican border. So they're very involved in a domestic way, and that is putting a strain on their resources to do other things, but it's also forcing them to rethink this issue of balance. And I think it absolutely came to a head perfectly yesterday when you looked at the Navy did a press conference, particularly about the carrier Theodore Roosevelt, and I'll talk about that in a second. They also had military leaders go to the White House for the daily coronavirus briefing to talk about a counter-drug operation. So in this one day, you saw the military grappling with all three of these vectors. Here's forced propagation. We are putting ships at sea in the Atlantic and the Pacific and down in the Caribbean to deal with counter-drugs, drugs coming out of Venezuela. You saw them answer questions about Afghanistan and what we're doing with the drawdown there. You saw them also deal with issues about the hospital ships and about their force provision, guard, and reserves. And you certainly got a lot of taste of the struggles that they're having on the Theodore Roosevelt, a carrier that is now in Guam. They've moved about 1,000 sailors off. There's 100 infected sailors on that ship, and they're trying to find quarters ashore for another 2,700 of these sailors. So they're working this very, very hard. But it all kind of came to a head yesterday. And the problems that they're facing, in addition to trying to strike this balance, is also how to issue appropriate guidance down to the deck level. And the Navy in particular put out a message yesterday from the vice chief all the way down to unit commanding officers about what they should be doing to preserve both unit readiness and their force readiness, the health and welfare of their people. That's where I think you're going to see in coming weeks this balance get really acute for the military, because arguably they have a job to do. And Secretary Esper was very clear about that yesterday. We still have to defend the country. We can't just shut down for the virus. On the other hand, if you don't take care of your people, you're not going to have much ability to use your equipment and resources in defense of the country. So there's a near-term, long-term risk assessment that has to be done, and it's happening in real time every day. And it's really, I think, causing the Pentagon to rethink everything from the way they issue orders to the way they acquire resources. At the State Department, they too are trying to do this real-time balancing act. They've got, obviously they have to continue to carry out foreign policy of the United States and advance our interests around the world. At the same time, they have to take care of their own people, and they are involved in a pretty significant effort to try to repatriate Americans who are overseas and want to get back. I think, as I saw the stats this morning, they've repatriated some like 31,000 Americans from 70 some odd countries. They continue to work on this. It is not a mission set that the State Department is necessarily used to doing. This is sort of new ground for them in some ways. Obviously, we have consular and American citizen support that we do around the world, but repatriation of Americans on this scale is not something that they're used to. I think that there's been some struggles in that regard. They have not been, I haven't seen the hand wringing at the State Department quite that I've seen at the Pentagon with respect to achieving that proper balance. But in both institutions, we have seen a little bit of mixed messaging coming from the top down and policy guidance that seems to be much more tactical in terms of washing your hands, disinfecting surfaces, how not to propagate the disease, and not so much strategic prescriptive guidance that can really help senior level leaders in both institutions deal with how do they properly find that balance between mission accomplishment and force protection. And I think that's something that they're struggling with now to get their hands around. Briefly, I just want to talk about the media environment and that because I work in that environment. We too in the media are also trying to find balance. And for us, it's a balance that literally we're trying to strike minute by minute, because this story just changes literally all day long. So there's the balance of trying to cover not just the virus, which is clearly the lead story, but all the other stuff that's happening in the world that also matters. In television, it's not as easy to cover all that other news on air when you have a limited number of minutes in an hour to cover this particular story. So we try to supplement that through digital reporting, and we try to get, the campaign. And I know Laura's going to talk about this, but we are in the middle of a presidential campaign, and there hasn't been as much coverage of that as there would be had there not been the virus. So we're struggling with that every hour, literally. The other balance that we're trying to strike is just take the virus story alone, and how do you cover that appropriately? Because there's so many different pieces of this. Obviously, it's a public health crisis, but it's causing economic issues. There are political issues to cover, and of course, there are social issues to cover. We at CNN are trying very hard in any given hour of programming to try to touch on all of them. One of the things that you might see if you watch CNN is that we have really invested much more heavily in the use of medical experts in our programming. I don't think you can watch a single hour of CNN where you're not seeing doctors out in front talking about this, because we believe the public health aspect of this is the most important. I have done literally 2 on-air appearances in the last 3 weeks at CNN, and I'm perfectly fine with that. I mean, the story really should be about public health. I was on Saturday talking about the comfort going up to New York. I did 2 quick interviews in the morning, and that's been it. And so I think we really are trying to bring the story home to Americans in a way that matters to them by putting the right people on the air. The other balancing act that we're trying to achieve, and I know Laura's going to talk much more about this than me, is balancing the challenges of disinformation in the information environment. Look, the media are victims of disinformation too. We get sources, we get people that come to us all the time with fake news that want us to sort of chase it down. And of course, we have to deal with fact checking in real time right now. And I'm not trying to get partisan here, but we absolutely have to check sometimes in real time the information that's coming out from the administration, particularly from the president himself. And so when you'll see at the end of these press conferences that he does for 2 hours every day, President Trump, CNN will put on a fact checker, a young reporter by the name of Daniel Dale, who does a superb job to sort of run the audience through, okay, here's what the president said, and here's how it comports with the facts. It's unfortunate, but we have found ourselves having to do that because in some cases, the president himself is a source of some disinformation out there about the virus, and we want to be as accurate as we can. We at CNN have made a decision not to carry press conferences live from start to finish. We were doing that at first, but because they sometimes veer off into topics that aren't related to the virus or topics that we don't believe are important to our viewers, we kind of cut and go in and out depending on what's being covered. MSNBC follows a similar model. Fox News, of course, covers them live, start to finish. Those are editorial decisions that media outlets have to make, and the print outlets are doing this on their own in terms of how they're fashioning their front pages. But it is a real issue here with the virus because there is a lot of disinformation out there. And I know Laura's going to talk about this. Russia, the Chinese. There are non-state actors in the information space that are putting all kinds of false information out there. And it's all incumbent upon us as media outlets to do the best job we can sifting through that and putting real experts who know what they're talking about out there so that we can at least allow the viewers to make wise decisions for themselves. And I think I'm just going to stop right there, but that's kind of, to me, this is very much it's a balancing act, and it's a balancing act literally in real time, changing almost minute by minute. And you're seeing everybody trying to struggle with how to achieve that proper balance.
John, thank you very much. I mean, it's an incredibly difficult environment, obviously. And, for our European audience here, as well as the Americans who are tuned in with us today, I mean, you've characterized some of these things really, really well, and lots of things for us to come back to, which we will. Laura, let me turn to you maybe to pick up on some of the things that I know you would like to talk about and maybe take us a little bit more into that political dimension, both in terms of how it's affecting us in an election year, but also attempts to manipulate this from abroad and how that's being dealt with. But Laura, over to you, and thanks again.
Absolutely, Ian. Thanks so much. I'm really glad to be able to be here this morning and to join Rear Admiral Kirby for this important conversation. And thanks to everybody for tuning in. So I'm going to run through a couple of quick things, really building off of what John said. And the first is I actually want to take a step back and look at how in this moment of crisis, several of the dynamics around the crisis and successful handling it have run headlong into instincts that President Trump uniquely has and that have been characteristic of his presidency and his administration. And I think it's those tensions that I'll lay out in a moment that are some of the reason that we saw a very slow initial response by the president and a really sort of slow realization on his part of the magnitude of this crisis. The first is, the president has made no secret of his antipathy for expertise. He has surrounded himself with folks who, basically tell him what he wants to hear, who are not necessarily experts in particular areas. And he tends to marginalize what he often refers to as the deep state, or those who have real expertise in issues around national security or other areas. Many will have seen reports about how the Obama administration really handed over a pandemic response plan to the Trump administration that was basically jettisoned, and that the administration had shut down what had been an office in the National Security Council, where I used to work, that was responsible for handling pandemics. So that kind of real antipathy for expertise, I think, really set back the initial response by the president and this administration. The second is his view of the economy as the most important thing for his success and, frankly, for his own reelection. And the fact and the realization that taking the kind of measures that are necessary to flatten the curve, to slow the spread of the virus, social distancing, closing down a lot of businesses, was going to have a real impact on the economy. And you've heard his messaging at various points really come to the fore with the tensions around this, where he's been so hopeful at various points of getting things back on track. At one point he commented the cure can't be worse than the disease, really talking about the harm to the economy that we would see as a result of these measures that we're taking. And I think that becomes even more clear this morning, when we got the first reporting on unemployment filings for the month of March, and it was 6.6 million Americans who have filed unemployment claims, which is just an absolutely astounding number. And so for the president, this obviously is not just about the economy itself and the impact on Americans, but he sees it as very personal to him and his own success. And then the third piece, where I think it really runs against his instincts, is, the president has made no secret of his dislike for the media, his belief that a lot of reporters are out to get him, that, his commentary around the initial coverage of the virus was that it was overblown, that this was another hoax, and that this was really about targeting him. And so I think that those three areas where we really saw this, the need for a response to the virus run headlong into his instincts, created some initial challenges. Now that the reality of this has sunk in for him, I think he's really changed his messaging. We've seen in the last couple of days the press conferences that John mentioned. We've seen a much more somber tone from him. He's putting the experts out a bit more. He's now extended essentially the stay-at-home guidance until at least the end of April. So I think he really has, gotten there in terms of understanding the magnitude of this crisis and what's necessary to respond. But what we've seen in the interim is a really different manifestation of views about and responses to the virus in the red states, the Republican-leaning states, and the blue states. And because of issues around population density and all kinds of other factors, the virus is actually hitting or has hit some of the blue states hardest first, right? So New York, California, Washington in particular. But we're starting to see really concerning outbreaks in a number of the red states. Louisiana in particular is quite alarming in its numbers. And I think some of those views are going to change, but polling indicates really partisan views on both the virus itself and responses to it. And of course, this is not a virus that discriminates based on political party. And so I think that red state, blue state differentiation in views of the virus is actually potentially quite damaging. One positive note I do want to pick up on here, though, is I think that this crisis has been a reminder on the importance of both local government and local media. People are turning to local media sources much more than they have in quite a long time for information about what's happening in their own communities. And it's been local officials, governors, mayors, who have really been taking action very decisively in the absence of action by the federal government early on. And again, we've seen a little bit of the sort of red-blue manifestation there, where some officials who are more aligned with Trump, particularly the Florida governor, has been particularly slow to respond. I think, again, they're all sort of catching up to where he is, but the partisan angle around the virus and the response, I think, is something that's really damaging and concerning to me personally. As was mentioned earlier, obviously this is all taking place in the context or at the same time as an ongoing presidential election campaign. several primaries, most primaries at this point have been delayed. There is actually one scheduled for next week that in Wisconsin that the state is still planning to go ahead with. And there's a lot of back and forth around whether that's a prudent thing to do. Joe Biden has a pretty decisive lead in terms of pledged delegates at this point. Senator Sanders has not yet dropped out of the race. He's under increasing pressure to do so, in part because nobody knows when these primaries are going to be able to be held. There's concerns about people actually being at risk going to the polls. And there's a lot of conversation about, in fact, what to do with the Democratic convention this summer. The last time a nationwide election has been held in the middle of a pandemic was in 1918. There were midterm elections. And of course, campaigning today is very different than what it was in 1918. And that was congressional elections, not a presidential. So we don't really have much of a sense of what it means to campaign in the middle of a pandemic. There's the physical manifestations and challenges of that, whether that's you can't hold rallies in person, you can't go canvassing, knocking on doors. There's those sorts of challenges. And then there's the broader messaging challenge. President Trump has been very good. He was very good in 2016 at controlling the narrative and driving the coverage and the storyline during the campaign. That's been the same this cycle in general. And of course, he now has the bully pulpit of the presidency. And I think, what we've seen in this pandemic is that he's actually taken these press conferences that he's doing every evening and essentially turned them into substitutes for his campaign rallies. And so it's very hard for anyone else, particularly for someone like Joe Biden, who's trying really hard to be present and get out there with quality information. He realized very early on the seriousness of this crisis, but breaking through is going to be really hard. And the last point I'll make on the campaign is that there are conversations underway about what this means for the actual election in November. No one really knows exactly how long the concerns about the pandemic spread are going to last. And there have been some very quick moves to try to enable vote by mail in many more states in the US. The problem is there's a logistical challenge there, and there's a financial challenge, a resource challenge. And while there was a minimal amount of money that made it into the third supplemental package passed by Congress to provide funding for the states for that, it really did not come anywhere close to enough to do what's necessary to turn that ship, if you will, and enable mail voting in November. The last piece I pick up on briefly is this conversation about disinformation. The WHO has talked about the fact that alongside the pandemic that we have an infodemic, and basically, a lot of really misleading information, polluting the information environment that is spreading alongside the virus. And that infodemic is actually very damaging to the pandemic response, because if people don't have good quality information, they don't know who to listen to, it's very confusing and can actually undermine the response to the virus. There's a whole range of actors that are engaging in that kind of information manipulation. The president himself, as John mentioned, has oftentimes spread mis or disinformation about the virus. We've seen members of Congress do the same. We've seen other world leaders. Jair Bolsonaro actually had some of his tweets taken down by Twitter earlier this week, and had a Facebook live press conference halted by Facebook in the middle because he was spouting so much disinformation about this virus. So a lot of concerns about that, a lot of concerns about domestic actors, actors who simply are trying to use some of these social media platforms to be able to make a buck. Literally, you can make money off of some of these things. A lot of the platforms have now banned the selling of masks and PPE and all that kind of stuff online to try to get at some of that. And then there's the foreign actors that are using the information manipulation tactics as tools of geopolitics. And I'll just focus in really quickly on actually the messaging we're seeing coming from the Chinese Communist Party and its entities, because it's been the most interesting in this context. People have really heard a lot, I'm sure, about Russian disinformation, but the COVID-19 crisis has actually served as a departure point in the tactics that we've seen the Chinese party state using, actually really picking up on tactics from the Russian playbook, the active spread of disinformation through their diplomatic accounts, the use of their official state media to spread conflicting narratives, particularly about where the virus actually started. One viral theory that they've been spreading is that the virus was actually the result of a U.S. bioweapons attack in Wuhan by U.S. Army officers. Of course, there's absolutely no evidence for that. But the spread of multiple conflicting narratives is something we've also seen. So, for instance, maybe the virus actually started in Italy is another thing that they've spread through their official state media. And then the use and engagement on what we talk about is these sort of gray conspiracy websites and outlets that are known disinformation promoters that we often see taking part in the Russian disinformation ecosystem. But now Chinese diplomats and officials are actually using those same sites to amplify and spread disinformation. And I think some of that's about taking advantage of the US missteps. Some of that's about protecting China from its own, from its own failings, trying to rewrite the narratives about the CCP's own initial failings internally. The last thing I'll say that we've seen in this sort of information space from China has been very, very noisy, loud propaganda touting the aid that it is providing to European countries. Now, we now know that much of that aid has ended up being malfunctioning equipment or defective equipment. But that has not stopped some very loud propaganda efforts that are basically aimed at portraying China as the model and the partner of first resort for European countries as the US seeks to deal with its own crisis internally. And I thought it was quite interesting that the EU High Rep, Josep Borrell, actually called out the need for European countries to not fall for this global narrative battle that was happening and to be very clear-eyed about it. So a lot of different dimensions of the infodemic, but that was the piece I wanted to focus on. So I'll pause with that so we have time for questions.
Laura, thank you very much for that. And in fact, while the two of you have been speaking, we've accumulated quite a few very interesting questions from a lot of very interesting people. And I had a couple of my own, but I'm actually going to hold those because I'm conscious of our time as well. And I want to be sure that we get these questions out to you. And they're nicely distributed, in fact, I think, in the spaces that you've both addressed. The first one really is maybe more for John. It actually comes from Vice Admiral Henri Schrieke. I think you may know him from the French Armed Services. He asks a question about lessons learned from earlier Western experiences, places where the COVID virus struck first. Was the US military watching this? Did they see what was happening to other services in other places? And are they paying attention to those kinds of lessons learned?
Well, with the caveat that I'm not in the room anymore at the Pentagon and I don't have access to the information that they're receiving, senior leaders. I'm still in contact with my former colleagues at various levels of leadership, particularly in the Navy. And I can assure you that, yes, they were watching this very closely, particularly in the Pacific region and in the Mediterranean in Europe. Both not just Navy, but the unified commanders were watching this very, very closely. And obviously, the main concern for them was, force protection. And I think the best example of this, I mean, there's lots of them, but the best one is General Abrams, our U.S. Forces commander in Korea on the peninsula, took very early action to isolate troops and families, to restrict access to our base and facilities because he did see this coming. Now, of course, the South Korean government handled this also very aggressively as well. So he was in step with them and in constant contact with our South Korean allies. You could say the same for much of what we did in Italy. Admiral James Fogo, our Navy Europe commander, was also very much on step with this because he saw it unfolding early on in Italy. So yes, they were watching this. And I can also say unequivocally that they are still watching this and still trying to learn the right lessons from this. As I said, what they're struggling with is how do you ensure readiness now and in the future, at the same time deal with a force that is becoming increasingly ill, because without that healthy force, your readiness is going to be chipped away at. And so they're struggling with that, because not only do they have global national security responsibilities, but they are increasingly now being called on domestic security responsibilities, domestic resources involved. So again, they're still trying to balance that. But yes, they were watching this very closely, and I think knowing them the way I know them, they are already keeping vociferous notes about how to prepare for this in the future.
John, thanks very much. Let me go to the next question, which is also an extremely interesting one. I'm going to paraphrase this slightly, but basically, this is from Adam Isaacs at the European Parliament, is asking about the balance between state and federal power and interest and action in the United States in the context of the crisis. Thinking a little bit about, we were actually chatting about this earlier, a little bit about the analogs with the tensions between national and EU level decision-making here in Europe. I mean, how do you see that playing out? I know, Laura, you hinted a little bit at this in your remarks as well, but maybe for the two of you, Laura first perhaps, how do you see this evolving, state-federal balance?
I can speak briefly to it. With the caveat that I'm not a sort of legal expert or constitutional expert in the dynamics of, federal and state power and federalism specifically. But I would say a couple things. I mean, one is that I do think, a lot of these areas are places where we do need the leadership to come from the states, and the authorities largely do rest with the states. And if the U.S. is functioning right, as it's set up to function, that you would see a lot of that activity coming from the governors, as we have. What I think has been missing here, at least from my perspective, is two things. One is that even in a space where you have primary action at the state level by governors, you'll often see leadership, whether it's rhetorical or a broad communication strategy urging governors to take certain kinds of actions from the president, from the White House, even if the White House is not the one writing the orders, but really communicating with the governors to act in a coordinated way. And I think that's one thing that's really been missing here, at least early on, which led to this real patchwork set of responses by different governors at different times in different ways. Some governors have coordinated, especially in areas where you have a lot of high traffic across borders. So around the New York, New Jersey, Connecticut area, you've seen some coordination, you've seen some tensions there, with Rhode Island in particular, really saying they were going to go after New Yorkers who were fleeing there, and Governor Cuomo threatening the Rhode Island governor, obviously not constructive to a coherent response. But here in the DC area, we've actually seen coordination between the DC mayor, the Maryland governor, and the Virginia governor, all acting, sort of each step they've taken to the best ability to be in tandem, given how much, cross-border traffic there is. So I think that sort of coordination is really necessary from the federal level, even if it's ultimately action at the state level. The other piece I would note that is really important at the federal level, and John may be able to get into this a little bit more, is this activity around the Defense Production Act. And this is an authority that the president has to basically use the Department of Defense to essentially contract out and buy up the production of necessary equipment, whether it's masks and PPE or ventilators, from companies that might not normally produce those things or might not have the economic incentives to produce them without a guaranteed buyer by the government. And you've seen a real back and forth between, particularly Governor Cuomo, really pushing for the president to act early on to use these authorities, and a real reluctance by the president to do so. And that is an area where there really is a need for a federal response to use some of those authorities that governors simply don't have. And that's, I think, an area where, unfortunately, we've not seen enough action from the White House. I'm sure John has points he would add on this.
No, I couldn't agree more. In fact, I was thinking about the DPAs you were talking, Laura. I mean, when it's an issue of expediency, and that's what we're in right now, then that's not the, but it should be a factor in determining the degree of aggressiveness by the federal government and the amount of authorities they're willing to assume for themselves. I think that's a great example of exactly one where they should, because it also, to your point, some governors are getting along and some aren't. By federalizing that effort, you take away that competition, you take away that need for interstate rivalry, as it were. And so I think it's a great example. The other thing that I'd say, just adding on, is there's been lots of questions about the federalizing of the National Guard and the troops. And I think that's clearly an option that the commander-in-chief has at his disposal. Yes, there will be concerns over posse comitatus and the degree to which troops can act as law enforcement officials and all that. So but I don't think we're there yet. I think so far, I think as of yesterday, I think we had 16,000 National Guardsmen called up by the governors. Some of their activities are being funded through FEMA, in other words, federally, so the states aren't paying for it, which I think, again, is a nice way of sort of putting them under the authority of the governors, as is appropriate, but the governors, the states, aren't having to pay for those services. So I think we are so far achieving that right balance right now, and every state gets to decide sort of how they're going to use their National Guard and reserves. The active duty component is being employed from the federal level with respect to the mercy and the comfort, the mobile surgical hospitals, the logistics and transportation capabilities that we have inherent to us. But I think thus far, there's been a fair understanding of the need that we don't need to completely federalize military support in the states, because, as the Secretary of Defense said yesterday, they have a whole swath of other national security demands that they have to face around the world. So I think right now we've gotten that balance about right.
Okay, thanks very much, and thanks for mentioning the Defense Production Act, because actually there was a question in the queue exactly about that. So thank you. The next question is from Gerald Loftus here in Brussels, and he asked really quite a simple one: who is in charge? There are all of these figures who have asserted different roles in this: Deborah Birx, Fauci, Mike Pence, Kushner. I mean, there's a long list of people who seem to have a voice in all of this. For the two of you, what's your read about who's in charge?
I'll let Laura go with that.
Oh, I was going to let you go first.
It's not a simple question.
I mean, I think from the president's perspective, the president is in charge. And I think you saw a really interesting dynamic. I can't even keep track of time anymore. I was going to say it was a few weeks ago, but I actually have no idea how long ago it was. But there was a time where he put Vice President Pence in charge, and it was the vice president that was going out, and he was leading the press conferences, and they were very calm, they were clear, and the vice president was getting a lot of really good praise for the way he was handling and coordinating things. And it was then that you saw the president come in and start to handle the press conferences himself and start to be the spokesperson directly. And I think it's pretty clear that from the president's perspective, he does not want anybody outshining him. And you will recall, well, maybe not, I recall very well, a line that was in the president's then candidate Trump's speech at the Republican convention in 2016. And he was talking about all the troubles that, in his view, the United States was facing. And his diagnosis was, I alone can fix it. And I think that the president still genuinely thinks that he alone can fix things. And that goes back to, I think, some of these tensions that I was talking about in my opening comments with his instincts, is in fact, no, in this moment, he alone cannot fix this. Expertise is really required, and it can't really just fall to him. But I think in his mind, he still has to be the guy in charge. Now, what that actually looks like and who's actually in charge, I think is a different question. So I don't know if John has insight on that, but that'd be my attempt to answer the question.
John, yeah, and maybe if you could say something as well about this, the role of FEMA and all of this.
Yeah, I mean, this is it is a team effort, and Laura's right. I mean, you have this coronavirus task force ostensibly headed up by the vice president, who appears to be doing a pretty good job in terms of managing the disparate agencies that are involved and the resources that have to be applied to it. it is, as we talked about earlier, it's not just a public health crisis, although it is first and foremost that. It is economic, it is political, and it has social dimensions. And so I think the lion's share of the work is being done under the leadership of the vice president. But Laura's right, and you asked about FEMA. FEMA certainly is one of those agencies that has a key role here.
And for our European audience, it's the Federal Emergency Management Agency. Sorry, I didn't mean to.
Right. Yeah. Sorry about
the
that.
acronym.
Yeah. No, I apologize. But that's appropriate because when we have a disaster here in the United States, a hurricane, a flood, it is FEMA. It is through FEMA through which the resources flow, both in terms of manpower, money, aid and assistance. All that flows through FEMA, and they're treating this as a public health crisis, and therefore they are, I think, appropriately trying to funnel things through FEMA. Even, as I just mentioned, the military support. All the requests by the states for active duty military support, this is not the National Guards, but the active duty, is all being funneled through FEMA. And I think that's appropriate. But I would go back to what Laura said. I think President Trump does want to own this. I think he wants to be out front, and he certainly is in terms of dominating the daily press conferences. But you know what? And again, regardless of his style and his mistakes and maybe some of his egregious misstatements, I mean, that is actually appropriate. And he is the president, he's the commander in chief, and I think we should all want the president to lead. You could argue about the quality of that leadership right now. That's a fair debate, but it is his role. It should be his role. And I think in any other administration, we would expect the same.
I'm conscious of our time, and I did want to get in a question that it seems to me especially relevant when you ask it from Brussels. NATO. NATO is doing things. It's doing some practical things. There have even been calls for NATO or a member to invoke Article 5 over this. That's, of course, only happened once after September 11th. What do either of you make about that in the context of the sort of broader question of transatlantic cooperation, which seems kind of a nice, for GMF anyway, a nice way to sort of end our conversation. But should NATO be doing more?
I think there's a couple of thoughts here. One, I think that this virus is forcing us to rethink now alliances and partnerships and the roles of members in these multilateral organizations. And I think I hope that what this does is strengthen the NATO muscle and sinew, because we do need to rely on one another. There are capabilities that other NATO partners have that we should all be pulling from. I think that's healthy. Having dialogue, lessons learned, sharing that stuff in real time, I think is valuable. So I would hope that this strengthens those NATO ties. I'm a little worried that this administration has not put the effort investing in multilateral organizations, and NATO included, over the last 3 years, so that we as the United States might not be able to benefit as much from those kinds of discussions as we should. Whether it's calls for Article 5, I mean, I don't know that we're there yet. I mean, I worry a little. I worry when we compare this virus response to a war. I mean, I get the analogy. I understand the sense of urgency and the mind image that puts in people's heads about how we're going to attack the problem. But it is not a war in that sense, and I wouldn't want to see us militarize the response to the virus. Can it make us stronger? Can it improve our relationships? Yeah, I think that's good, but I wouldn't want to see it militarized. Interesting that I think the foreign ministers, NATO foreign ministers, are meeting today, and they're doing it virtually.
Yes,
this is clearly going to be top of the agenda, according to Jens Stoltenberg. Again, perfectly appropriate. So it'll be really interesting to see what comes out of that today, if they issue a communique and sort of how they are going to use the forum of NATO, use it as a vehicle to try to drive better international cooperation in terms of response.
John, thanks. Laura, last thought on this, or another thought, another question?
Yeah, I'll just touch briefly on this and then pan out a bit. I mean, obviously, NATO has served a really important role as a political military alliance, and through many different challenges. But I think in recent years, there's been a lot of discussions happening in the NATO context about, particularly questions about what does defense mean? What is the the idea of collective defense, how does it apply? You know, we've had lengthy conversations, for instance, about cyberspace and what it means there, outer space and what it means there. Lots of discussion about hybrid threats, how and where NATO can and can't act in those spaces. And I think the, you know, COVID-19 crisis is another example of one of these non-traditional threats that has a very, very direct impact on the alliance and on allies' security. And so while it's not a sort of in the moment kind of question to be addressed, I think for me, it does point to the broader conversation that I do think is happening somewhat within NATO, but probably needs even more conversation, hopefully led by a thoughtful US leader, quote, closely working with our other NATO allies about how we ensure that NATO remains fit to the challenges of the 21st century and can be flexible, you know, within its mandate, but to actually address the challenges that allies are collectively facing. So for me, this is just another moment to reflect on, I think, that broader question.
Laura, John, thank you both very, very, very much for this. This has been a great conversation. I apologize. I know a number of others were trying to come in with questions, but well, you know, we're going to do more of these and please hold them. Hopefully we'll be in a somewhat more optimistic moment and there'll be different kinds of questions, but we'll see about that. Let me also thank my colleagues in Washington from our strategic convening team, in particular, Zach Darrant and others, for making all of this happen, putting it together. We're really grateful. And above all, we're grateful to all of you who've joined us from both sides of the Atlantic. We look forward to having you with us again soon. So thank you. Good afternoon. Good morning. See you soon.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye.